But rather than stay with that, I wanted to ask you a further question, something that you mentioned fairly early on in the aims of analysis. And it made my ears perk up just because you mentioned the function of the one, and the one here with a capital zero, O. And you note that the one, as it is usually translated, can also be a one. And it sounds like a slightly pedantic distinction there, but to me, this was really, really crucial. But maybe it would help if I back up a little and just give a bit more context for this question, which is very much about what does Lacan mean by the one or a one in his later work. So in seminar 20, which we've just been discussing about, you cite Lacan there and explain Lacan's late views on what science is, or develop some of his views on what science is. And you foreground how the notion, the famous axiom, there is no sexual relationship, extends also to phantasmatic notions of harmony and balance. It's a really crucial point. The point was made very powerfully by you. And it really, is quite striking, because in so many everyday kind of conversations, whether it's about climate change, whether it's about whatever, you realize that people are often working with the assumption that underlying the kind of cosmic order, or even a kind of vaguely scientific imaginary, there is a notion that there will be some balance, some kind of homeostasis. Nonetheless, in talking about there is no sexual relationship and how this is an axiom that upsets these assumptions of harmony, of complementarity, of some kind of utopian yin-yang balance, you also suggest that this is one way of thinking about, critically, about what science might be. And indeed, we could say that the idealism of a kind of yin-yang thinking, this harmony, balance, is a regression from modern science to a science of antiquity. In seminar 20, it seems precisely this function of the one which distinguishes between these two eras of science, because this one does not itself allow, it does not enable the notion of a harmonious sexual relationship. So that's a little bit rambling on my part, sorry about that, but could you elaborate? Is the one a function which fundamentally defies discourses of harmonization, of union, of balance? And does that tell us something about a Lacanian perspective on what modern science should do or be?
It's a great question. It's a long, complex question that I'm going to try to offer some kind of answer for. But and let me make a couple comments real quickly here, just to set this up. So the couple things. One is, there are different notions of one throughout Lacan's work. You could almost work on an idea of what's the imaginary one. The unary trait is something like a symbolic one, and so forth. But the one that Lacan develops starting, say, at this point in the late Lacan is, as you point out, capital O-N-E. It's l'un in French. And the thing that I've always been struck with is, the French word for one, as Lacan uses it, also is the word for a, like the a, a tree, a horse. And from my perspective, there's a certain value of thinking about it in those terms, because it means it's a singular, it represents a sort of singular entity of one. This is a one that is singular for each speaking being. And this is a real, I think you could say this is a real one that Lacan is talking about here, or a symptomatic one that is singular for any speaking being. And I think the idea that Lacan developed, say, in seminar 20, and I'll get to the science point in a bit, but I just want to set up the concept of the one a bit first. What Lacan is trying to get at, I think, is that and this comes through in the clinic of psychoanalysis, that certain, we could say certain things keep getting reiterated by the analysand in the discourse of the analysand. Lacan in chapter 2 of Seminar 20 talks about this as, we have to treat this seriously. And by serious, he's referring to seriality and the fact that there's an iteration and reiteration and reiteration, a kind of real repetition of some, ultimately we could call it real or jouissance, that gets keeps getting reiterated in the discourse of the analysand. And that is the real one that's at stake for that analysand. And invariably, it does connect with some drive component, something sexual and so forth. So in thinking about what the one can be at this moment in Lacan's work, I think that the idea is you could say it's a kind of libidinal formation that's unique and particular for each speaking being, and that exists, you could almost say, independent of the presence of other people. So that would be a way of kind of introducing the notion of the one. Now, in going to the question that you had about science, I think what Lacan develops, I believe it's in chapter 4 of Seminar 20 that I discuss, and the references for this are all in the book. But what Lacan develops is something that I thought was very interesting, a way of periodizing science based on the existence of letters. So he takes Galileo's formula for gravitation, and he says that this is a kind of modern science because the letters in the formula, force equals gravitational constant times the mass of the two bodies divided by the distance squared. He takes that formula for gravitation, and he says that somehow those letters capture something of the scientific real. And that way of thinking about science for Lacan is completely distinct from everything that he refers to as pre-modern science, all of which is based on a fantasy of sexual harmony, as he puts it, more or less in Seminar 20. In other words, there's a fantasy that often involves active and passive and form and matter. And there's some references to Aristotle in Lacan, but this continues throughout science. And it has to do with what would be a distinction, I would say, between fantasy, which is in the Lacanian terms, the relationship of the subject and the object, but a particular fantasized, harmonious fantasy of sexual union, and this cut that represents modern science. And the point that I wanted to make in the book was that, let me try to find a way to say this. This all sounds very heady, kind of scientific epistemology and stuff like that. I mean, is this really relevant for a psychoanalyst? And it is, because as you point out, and I give a couple of examples in the book, people use scientific ideas or notions in ways that are that can be very much reflective, not of modern science as such, but of as you quoted, kind of these notions of harmony. Like this comes up all the time for anyone who practices. People have concerns about the relationship they have with their own bodies. Mm-hmm. And imagine that I can have a harmonious relationship with my body, like that. As opposed to the idea that to a certain extent, there's always going to be a problematic or a conflictual relationship between a speaking being and its body, or relationship between people and their partners, their spouses, significant others, a relationship between humans and the world, the earth, the issues, how one frames something like climate change can say a lot about what they think is possible in the relationship between speaking beings and the earth. And it's not to say that there aren't real issues like, global warming and so forth, but if you have to listen, I believe it's very important to listen to the discourse of the Analysan to see the way they use the words to frame a particular situation. Because in many cases, what's being introduced as science or a science-like explanation for something is merely what Lacan refers to as in the Seminar 20 as fantasy. And it has to do with a harmonious, let's say it, a harmonious relationship with the other, as opposed to the fact that when it comes to, the libido, it doesn't quite work out that way. So I don't know, does that, I hope that gets to the question you were asking. So
no, it's great. It helps me think about a couple of things. One is just the notion of singularity. When you were speaking about the one, and this basically almost, you could say, an ethical postulate within clinical psychoanalysis, Lacanian practice, is to be alert to the irreducibility of the singularity of someone whom one is working with, which is almost an impossible thing. You're constantly, in a way, at risk of imaginarizing who they are, so on and so forth. But that as a kind of ethical credo to bear in mind about the irreducibility, the singularity of the subject, I think is crucial. But also what it reminds me of is even in the Freud letters to Fliess, this, I'll probably misquote him, but, this elementary pre-real, pre-Lacanian concept where Freud says there's something in the sexual function which just doesn't actually work. There's a kind of primal discordance, a dissonance. And so when you were talking about people in their relationship to their bodies, and it's a point I try to make in teaching the material and just say, well, there is always necessarily a minimal discordance in the subject's relationship to their body, in as much as it applies also to the subject's relationship to anyone else and to the world as well. And hence we shouldn't be surprised by that. And one can understand, therefore, why the utopian hope of some harmonization is constantly reiterated, despite that it is fundamentally phantasmatic in the way you describe. So that was great, Tom, thanks.